Nokia refused to die, not when it lost 98% of its value, not when its phones vanished from pockets around the world. Because while the world was busy writing Nokia off, Nokia was rewriting itself.
So today we're announcing that Nvidia has a new product line. It's called the Nvidia ARC, the Aerial Radio Network Computer. And Nokia is going to work with us to integrate our technology.
This was a company that once controlled nearly half the global phone market, a brand so dominant that for millions of people, mobile phone simply meant Nokia. And then came the collapse. The iPhone changed the rules.
One device. And we are calling it iPhone. And here it is.
Android flooded the market. Customers upgraded without them. In just a few brutal years, Nokia went from industry king to corporate cautionary tale. Most companies don't survive a fall like that. Many never even get the chance. But Nokia made a decision that stunned the business world. It walked away from the very product that made it famous. Imagine Apple abandoning the iPhone or Nike quitting sneakers. That is the scale of what Nokia chose to do. Instead of clinging to the past, it sold its dying phone division, dismantled its identity, and bet everything on a future almost no one understood. For a while, it looked like desperation, until something unexpected happened. The same company investors once dismissed, the same brand people assumed was gone, quietly rebuilt itself into one of the most critical players in global telecommunications. And more than a decade after its near-death moment, one of the most powerful technology companies on Earth placed a multi-billion-dollar bet on Nokia's future.
Nvidia is investing $1 billion in Nokia. $1 billion, it will take a 2.9% stake in Nokia. I know what you're thinking. Why is Nvidia investing so much money in Nokia? Didn't the company go bust? Well, the answer is no.
So how does a company lose almost everything and still refuse to disappear? How do you reinvent yourself after the world stops believing in you? And why might writing Nokia off today be the same mistake people made before its last comeback? To understand how close Nokia came to disappearing, we have to go back to a moment when the company made a decision that would transform it into a global empire, and unknowingly plant the seeds of its downfall. Long before Apple keynotes and Android updates shaped the tech calendar, Nokia was already rewriting the rules of communication. But what makes Nokia remarkable is that it didn't begin as a technology company at all. It started in 1865 as a paper mill in southern Finland, a quiet industrial operation built along a river during a time when Finland was still part of the Russian Empire. Over the decades, the company expanded into rubber, cables, and electronics. For much of the 20th century, Nokia was less a single business and more a collection of industries stitched together. Then came the decision that changed everything. In the early 1990s, CEO Jorma Ollila looked at the sprawling conglomerate and made a call that many executives would have been too cautious to attempt. He sold off large portions of the company, paper, tires, consumer goods, and pushed Nokia toward a singular future, telecommunications. It was a massive bet on a world that barely existed yet. Mobile phones were expensive, coverage was limited, adoption was uncertain, but Ollila saw something others didn't. A future where mobile communication wouldn't be a luxury. It would be essential. The strategy worked faster than almost anyone imagined. By 1998, Nokia had become the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer. By 2000, its market value had soared into the hundreds of billions during the dot-com boom, making it one of Europe's most valuable companies. And then came the device that would cement its legend, the Nokia 3310. Simple, durable, nearly indestructible. It sold roughly 126 million units worldwide. Becoming more than a phone, it became a cultural icon. For millions of people, Nokia wasn't just their first mobile device. It was their first connection to the digital world. At its peak, Nokia controlled close to 40% of the global mobile phone market, more than several competitors combined. Finland itself seemed to rise alongside the company. Economists often pointed out that Nokia influenced exports, employment, and even national confidence. For a moment in time, Nokia didn't just dominate an industry, it defined it. But dominance carries a hidden danger. Success can create clarity, or it can create blindness. And inside Nokia, something subtle was beginning to shift. Former executives and researchers would later describe a culture where bad news traveled slowly upward. Engineers hesitated to challenge leadership. Middle managers softened warnings before they reached the top. Professor Yves Doz of INSEAD famously observed, Nokia's problem was not technological incompetence, it was organizational fear. The company still built excellent hardware, but the world was quietly changing. And Nokia, despite its scale, was about to confront a threat it did not fully understand. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and introduced a device that looked nothing like the phones dominating the market. No physical keyboard, a large touchscreen. Software is at the center of the experience. The iPhone. Inside Nokia, teams quickly analyzed the new competitor. Some warned it could redefine the industry. Leadership wasn't convinced. The device was expensive, fragile by Nokia standards, limited in battery life. To many within the company, it looked like a niche product for high-end consumers, not a mass-market threat. And for a brief moment, the numbers seemed to support that belief. But history rarely announces disruption politely. While Nokia focused on refining hardware, Apple and soon Google were building ecosystems, developers, app stores, software platforms, entire digital universes. And Nokia was about to learn a painful lesson. When an industry shifts beneath you, past success becomes the heaviest thing you carry, because the empire that once looked unshakable was already standing on unstable ground. By the end of the 2000s, the warning signs were no longer subtle. Touchscreen phones were improving fast. Apps were becoming the new currency of mobile computing. Developers were flocking toward iOS and Android, not because they were perfect, but because they were evolving. Meanwhile, Nokia was trapped inside its own success. Its operating system, Symbian, powered hundreds of millions of devices, but it was aging badly. The software was complicated for developers, slow to adapt, and increasingly incapable of delivering the seamless experience consumers were beginning to expect. And yet, internally, there was hesitation. Changing platforms meant risking everything. So for a while, Nokia tried to do what many giants attempt during disruption, adjust without truly transforming. Then, in September 2010, the board made one of the most controversial hires in European tech history. They brought in Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, the first non-Finnish CEO Nokia had ever appointed. He stepped into a company that still generated billions in revenue, but was losing relevance at frightening speed. 5 months later, Elop sent a memo that would become one of the most famous internal communications ever leaked to the public. He described Nokia as a man standing on a burning platform. The oil rig analogy was brutal. Stay where you are and burn. Jump into freezing waters and you might survive. The message was meant for employees. Instead, it reached the press within days. And suddenly, customers across the world heard the CEO effectively admit that Nokia's current products were a dead end. The impact was immediate. Smartphone sales began collapsing faster than analysts expected. Because once consumers believe a product has no future, they stop buying it. Elop didn't stop there. In 2011, Nokia made a defining choice, one that historians still debate today. Instead of adopting Android, which Samsung was already embracing, Nokia partnered exclusively with Microsoft to build phones around Windows Phone. The reasoning sounded logical on paper. On Android, Nokia would just be another manufacturer competing on hardware margins. With Microsoft, they could build a differentiated ecosystem, maybe even challenge Apple directly. But strategy is only as strong as execution and timing. By the time Nokia's Lumia devices arrived, developers had already committed themselves elsewhere. Apple's App Store had exploded past hundreds of thousands of applications. Google Play was scaling at an extraordinary speed. What about the Windows Phone? It struggled to attract the software that makes smartphones indispensable. Consumers noticed. Beautiful hardware couldn't compensate for missing apps. Between 2010 and 2014, Nokia's global smartphone share fell from roughly 33% to under 3%. It was one of the fastest collapses ever recorded in consumer technology. Meanwhile, the financial damage was accelerating. Revenue declined sharply. Operating losses mounted into the billions of euros. The stock, once a symbol of European innovation, drifted toward irrelevance. By July 2012, shares hit about 1.33 cents, representing a roughly 98% drop from their peak during the early 2000s. Analysts openly discussed bankruptcy scenarios, but something important often gets missed when people retell Nokia's fall. The company wasn't blind, it was conflicted. Later research from INSEAD suggested Nokia engineers understood the threat from Apple earlier than many assumed. Some prototypes even rivaled early smartphones. But internal politics, fear of failure, and slow decision-making created paralysis. As one former executive summarized, "We had the technology. What we lacked was the courage to move fast enough." Then came the moment that forced reality into the boardroom. Losses were no longer theoretical, they were existential. So when Microsoft approached Nokia about buying its phone division, leadership faced a question few companies ever dare to answer honestly. What if the business that made us famous is the very thing killing us? In September 2013, Nokia agreed to sell its devices and services unit to Microsoft for about $7.2 billion. To outsiders, it looked like surrender. The company that once defined mobile phones was abandoning them. But inside Nokia, the decision reflected something deeper. It was acceptance. Acceptance that the smartphone war had already been lost. Acceptance that pride could no longer guide strategy. An acceptance that survival sometimes requires walking away from your own legacy. Yet what many didn't realize at the time was this. Nokia wasn't just selling a dying business. It was quietly repositioning itself for an entirely different future. Because hidden behind the collapsing phone empire was an asset most consumers had never paid attention to. An infrastructure business. Networks. The invisible architecture powering global communication. And soon, that forgotten division would become the foundation of one of the most surprising corporate reinventions of the modern era. But first, Nokia would have to prove something incredibly difficult. That it wasn't just a fallen phone maker. It was still capable of leading the next technological frontier. For years, Nokia existed in a strange space. Not dead, not dominant, just forgotten. The world had moved on to Apple, Samsung, and a new generation of tech giants. Meanwhile, Nokia quietly rebuilt itself behind the scenes, laying fiber networks, powering telecom infrastructure, and collecting billions through patent licensing. Most consumers never noticed. But inside the telecom industry, Nokia was still everywhere. By the early 2020s, global carriers were racing to build 5G networks, and Nokia had secured contracts with major operators, positioning itself as one of the few Western alternatives to Chinese telecom giant Huawei after multiple governments restricted Huawei equipment over security concerns. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. And then, just as the tech world began obsessing over artificial intelligence, Nokia found itself sitting on something incredibly valuable: infrastructure. Because here's the reality most people don't think about. AI is useless without networks fast enough to carry its intelligence. Autonomous vehicles, smart factories, remote surgery, defense systems. None of it works without ultra-low latency connectivity. And building that connectivity requires companies like Nokia. Then came the moment almost nobody saw coming. In late 2025, at a major technology conference, Nvidia, the company powering the global AI boom, announced a deepened partnership with Nokia focused on building next-generation AI-ready wireless networks. The goal? To integrate AI computing directly into telecom infrastructure, allowing data to be processed closer to where it's created, something engineers call edge computing. Instead of sending information back and forth to distant data centers, networks themselves become intelligent. Faster decisions, lower energy usage, near-instant response times. Analysts immediately understood the implication. The future of AI wouldn't live only inside massive server farms. It would live inside the network. And Nokia already owned pieces of that network. As Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang has repeatedly emphasized, AI is becoming infrastructure, just like electricity and the internet. If that prediction holds, companies controlling connectivity could become some of the most important players in the next technological era. Almost overnight, the narrative around Nokia began to shift. Not a relic, not a survivor, but a potential backbone of the AI economy. Still, the road ahead is far from guaranteed. Competition remains fierce. Ericsson continues to battle aggressively for telecom dominance. Samsung has expanded deeper into network equipment. Geopolitical tensions are reshaping which countries trust to build critical infrastructure. And telecom itself is a brutally cyclical industry. Massive contracts followed by long periods of slower growth. And now, Decades after a Finnish paper mill first carried its name, the company that once connected people through indestructible phones may help connect an AI-driven world. So the next time someone calls Nokia a failed tech giant, remember this. The Nokia 3310 became famous for one reason. You couldn't kill it. Turns out, neither could the company that made it.